Deus, o salutaris nostre, Domine ex Deus, Deus, Deus noster, Domine ex Deus, Angeli, Ave Pater, Domino Majestatis,
Guys, we're doing it. Been having a fantastic day. It is Wednesday, August 6th, and I'm here with another show. I'm here with one of those nice slideshow shows because I found some pretty awesome lore. I was just looking through some of the plenary councils of Baltimore. For those who don't know, there were a series of different councils held in the 19th century in Baltimore that were supposed to represent the entirety of the American episcopate. I don't know why. I don't even remember why I was looking through them. But I came across some interesting stuff, some papally approved decrees that are very interesting when you consider things like baptism of desire. You consider things like salvation outside of the church, no salvation outside of the church. Very interesting stuff. So in my constant desire to defend the teachings of the Second Vatican Council and its specific formulation of outside the church, there is no salvation, I kind of want to add this on as another piece going over the preconciliar magisterium and the preconciliar magisterium's teaching on this point. Now, I'm a little sick tonight, so if I sound weird or if I say anything dumb, it's because I'm sick. Okay, pay attention to what I say, I guess, not how I say it, because I'm kind of feeling under the weather, but I'm just going to push through. We're going to get through it. It's going to be an awesome show. If you haven't done it yet, subscribe, like, do all those different things, comment. You know what to do. I don't have to remind you of any of those things. But before we get into it, it's kind of been weird recently. A lot of response videos I've noticed. Some of them I will get, added in YouTube. It kind of functions like Twitter or other like Instagram or other social media sites. If you get somebody @s you in the title or the description, it actually pops up on your notifications. And I've seen a marked increase in a lot of people who are making these responses to me. And then I've seen a lot of people who don't even @ me in the responses, and they're making responses to me. I've seen shorts, videos, streams responding to various things that I've done. So I don't know what's up with that, because for the longest time, nobody would do a response to anything I did. Now it seems like there's a bunch of different responses. So sometimes if they're good or they have any sort of salient points, I will maybe I probably won't do a video or a stream against a lot of these individuals. I don't find most of what they say worth responding. I'm not being a jerk by saying that. I'm saying that if you watch what I originally said and then you watch what they said, you could figure it out on your own without me needing to do a sort of response. I'm not calling them stupid or anything like that. You could figure it out on your own. You don't really need my help. And there's other things where maybe I do need to say something in response. But this has been quite weird recently. I just saw Sean Luke. I didn't even know about this. Somebody had told me about it earlier. He did a response to my video on Sola Scriptura, and he just kind of threw out a bunch of stuff. I think with most of the stuff, if you watch both of our videos, you can kind of figure it out on your own and know how I'm going to respond. I don't think I really need to respond to most of what he said. Then he kind of throws out these things like, the weird polemical edge, calling me a blasphemer, calling me a neo-Romanist, neo-papist. They're always coming up with a bunch of new names. But you know what everyone calls us? Everyone calls us Catholic, okay? Always coming up with a bunch of new names for us. But he's calling me all these names. It's like, whatever. I have my fun. I had my fun. Now I think I need to lock in, sit down, and Be serious, maxing, okay? I need to lock in now. I can't be engaging in those shenanigans. I can't be leading you guys to uncharity. But I see it, and he's saying that I made up the argument. Like, I came up with the argument. He's saying this distinction right here, this argument right here, you made it up, Wagner. You made it up, and it's blasphemy, and it's blah, blah, blah. But what's really weird is that the argument that I gave and the distinction that I gave specifically between inspiration and infallibility is probably one of the most standard points to make when discussing this idea, which is technically speaking the criteria of canonicity. That is if you look in a manual of De Locis or you look in a manual of theology on De Fontibus Revelationes, when you look at all of these, if you look in the thesis and it says on the criterion of canonicity, look at that right there. Boom. You're going to get the distinction that I gave. You're going to give the argument that I gave, because I am the least unique, least creative person on YouTube. Okay. Anything you hear me say, I have copied it and pasted it from somebody else. I am so incredibly non-innovative. I say the same stuff that everyone else says. I repeat what everyone else says. There's really no reason for me to figure out stuff on my own or to make new arguments or anything like that. It's very rare that I say anything that I came up with. Almost non-existent that it's something that I came up with, okay? So if you're seeing somebody say that an argument was invented by me, they're probably lying or misinformed, okay? And in this case, it's very shocking that Mr. Luke did not know that this was a very standard argument that was brought forward by Roman Catholic authors. And this isn't even something that you have to go through, the Latin archives. You got to dig into the deep lore of the journal articles and the monographs on these issues, or maybe an obscure manual or Summa commentary or anything like that. You don't need that. This is pretty standard, even in English language stuff. So that's all that I say about that. I gave just one example of another author saying the same thing on Twitter and Telegram, so you can go and read that. But yeah, it's been strange to have all of these response videos coming down the line. Maybe I'll have to comment on something else from one of the other response videos. I'm not sure yet, but from what I've seen, I kind of go through the transcript. I don't listen to YouTube videos usually. I read through the transcripts. From what I've read through the transcripts for a lot of these videos, there's not really much worth responding to in the sense that I explained earlier. But anyways, let's actually get into the stuff about the Second Plenary Council of Baltimore. I don't want to yap about something else this whole time. Okay, let's get into the slideshow. And I gave you the exact location. If you want to look into the Acta of the Second Plenary Council of Baltimore, you can literally pick it up and read it. It's in first title in the decrees, chapter 1. You can read it. You can read all of the letters from Blessed Pius IX, all of the letters from the Sacred Congregation, the Propaganda Fide. You can read all of those different letters yourself. Now, you have to learn Latin in order to read them. But if you know Latin, you can easily read these. It's not that hard. The Latin is very simple. It's very easy. So if you want to read this yourself, just to know that I'm not making any of this up, check the Acta of the Council. You can find it on archive. It's not that hard to find. So when you look at the Feeneyite argument, for those who don't know what a Feeneyite is, or Feeneyism or anything like that, they have two central claims. And these two central claims are often misunderstood by a lot of the people who claim to refute the Feeneyites. They don't really understand actually what the Feeneyite claims are. Even some proponents of Feeneyism don't really understand what the Feeneyite claim is. There is two claims, okay? One, there is a necessity for sacramental baptism to be actually applied in order for somebody to be a member of the church. Well, in order for somebody to be saved, sorry. That other one, I'll clarify that in a second. So in order to be saved, you need to have actual sacramental baptism, okay? And related to the second one, you have to be a member of the church in order to be saved, okay? Because in Roman Catholic theology, and this is something that we agree upon, at least everyone should agree upon, in order to be a member of the Catholic Church, so in order to be joined in reality to the Catholic Church, one needs sacramental baptism, and one cannot be separated from the church by a culpable act of heresy, schism, or apostasy. This is pretty simple, pretty basic. If you don't know this, you should know this, because this is very important. And this is why a lot of people don't understand actually what the Feeneyite position is. Because what they're going to say is that when we say extra ecclesiam nulla salus, so outside of the church, there is no salvation, what we actually mean is we mean that outside of membership in the church, there is no salvation. So by sacramental baptism, one becomes a member of the church. And in order to be a member of the church, in order to be saved, you have to be a member of the church. So we can give a few examples of other individuals. So you can have people who are catechumens, for example. Catechumens, traditionally, we say that they are baptized by a baptism of desire. Catechumens are not members of the church. And catechumens are not joined as members of the church before their death, okay? So if you're a catechumen, you're unbaptized, but you want to join the church, you have a desire to enter in the church, and therefore you are joined by an act of the will, but you're not actually a member of the church. And this is a very important distinction, because really what this shows is this actually shows that the Vatican II teaching on membership, the necessity of membership of the church for salvation, that this is actually something which we find all throughout the entire tradition. So when you have, for example, somebody like St. Thomas saying that you have baptism of blood and baptism of desire that actually allows for somebody to be justified outside of membership in the church, this actually means that St. Thomas doesn't interpret the necessity of being joined to the church for salvation as a joining of membership. This is very, very vital, because when you read the various different dogmatic declarations of the church and the ways in which they describe the necessity of the church, they'll use terms like the Council of Florence, unless a man has joined himself to the church. To join yourself to the church does not mean necessarily to be entered into the church as a member through sacramental baptism. That is reading into it. And if you actually look at what the theologians believed who are at the council about baptism of desire, baptism of blood, we see that they didn't hold this at all. So these are various different assumptions which are made. So a lot of people, they kind of want to distinguish very strong, separate, I guess would be the best word. They want to separate this teaching on the one hand about baptism of desire, and on the other hand about the necessity of the church for salvation. But actually, these two go hand in hand. You cannot separate these two teachings for the Feeneyites. For the Feeneyites, in order to be saved, one is required to become a member of the church through sacramental baptism. Okay? So these two teachings stand together, and these two teachings fall together. If you admit that there is such a teaching as baptism of desire, baptism of blood, then you have to admit that there is a possibility of salvation for those who are not members of the church and who are rather joined through other ways, namely, we would say traditionally in voto, that is, in desire. So we bring forward a number of different arguments against the Feeneyites. This is going to be one in a long list of different arguments. If you look at former videos that I did, if you look at former articles that I wrote on my website, I go over a lot of these. I've covered a lot of them in detail. But basically, this is kind of the fourth in a line of different arguments that I usually will bring forward. So the first one is that the overwhelming majority of the consensus of theologians have held to this position. So when it comes to the traditional formulation of the consensus of theologians, when you have the theologians who are agreeing amongst themselves on a certain matter, there's different degrees or levels of this, but basically, if they agree at a level of certainty, then the doctrine is certain and binding. If they agree that this is a matter of faith, then it is something which is infallibly taught. But basically, the idea is that the consensus of theologians is authoritative and binding, and we have to hold to it. So we would say that when it comes to the issues of baptism of blood, baptism of desire, that there is a consensus of the theologians on this point that is higher than mere opinion. They argue from this from the deposit of faith. They argue for this from theological reasoning, okay? So this is something that they hold at least to be certain, and therefore it's something which is binding. So that's the first argument that we're going to bring forward. The second argument that we bring forward is something similar, and it's about the nature of the episcopate. When it comes to the episcopate, that is, when it comes to the entirety of the bishops of the world, they clearly hand down and teach the ideas in their catechisms and in their various different theological works and sermons, etc., etc. They very clearly teach this theological doctrine of baptism of blood, baptism of desire. And this is manifested actually in a very interesting situation right after the Second Plenary Council of Baltimore. This is at the First Vatican Council. So for those who don't know, the First Vatican Council, it was convened, and then it was unfortunately cut short because of various different political machinations during this time, the invasion and capture of Rome. So they had to cut it short. But before they cut it short, there was actually a document de ecclesia which was written. Originally, it was one document, and then it was split into two documents. The first one covered the role of the papacy, and the document on the role of the papacy ended up being dogmatically defined. Therefore, we know that Pastor Eternus, the teaching on papal infallibility was actually promulgated at Vatican I. But there was a second document that was written, presented to the Council Fathers, and the Council Fathers actually agreed upon the doctrine of this document. I go over in another article, but this other document, De Ecclesia, it actually goes over the issues of the necessity of the church for salvation. And it explains the necessity of the church for salvation in the exact same way that we now, to this day, explain the necessity of the church for salvation. And as theologians had described the necessity of the church for salvation for centuries at that point. It was basic teaching agreed upon throughout the episcopate. The Curia didn't disagree with it. Blessed Pius IX himself didn't disagree upon it. This was an agreed upon doctrine. Very clearly, this manifests the will of the Pope himself, the will of the entire council, the will of the entire episcopate, the will of the Curia, and of the best theologians of the age. Is that everyone, when they read this document, when they saw this document brought forward, everyone was basically like, "Yeah, I don't have a problem with what is being said here." And actually, any of the critiques that were had were actually in terms of weakening this doctrine and pulling it away from a very strict necessity of the church, which not a fan of. Okay, and I explain all of this in a, I think in I can't remember what the title of the video is, but it's like last week. So if you look for it, you should be able to find it. So we have Vatican I. Nobody's opposed to this in principle. And then we have a third case, and this is the case of after the arising of Feeney and the Feeneyite doctrine. We have the Holy Office replies under Venerable Pius XII in the 1950s. Okay, so the Holy Office replies, explains the traditional doctrine, and nobody has a problem with this either. So now that we've went over the sort of history of all of these different arguments that get brought forward, we can also go over the Council of Trent, for example. But there's now a fourth argument. And the fourth argument actually involves the direct participation of Blessed Pius IX, the direct participation of the Propaganda Fide under Blessed Pius IX. So the Curia discussed this matter. The Curia presented this before Blessed Pius IX, and he agreed to this teaching. He agreed and gave his explicit approval to this teaching to be sent to the Second Plenary Council of Baltimore. And again, nobody at this time has a problem with this. So if there weren't any Feeniites in the year 1967, 1968, where were they? That's my question, is if this is the traditional teaching of the church, where are these people for centuries? You don't find them. So to kind of give the background history, there were 3 plenary councils in Baltimore. Plenary basically means it was the entire nation coming together and giving a binding magisterial teachings, because it's not only the Pope and not only the Curia that is able to give binding teachings, but also councils of bishops, local councils of bishops, national councils of bishops are able to give binding teachings and legislation. So there were 3 plenary councils of Baltimore: 1852, 1866, 1884. You probably heard of the Baltimore Catechism, the Little Office of Baltimore, the Manual of Prayers of Baltimore. These things came from, I believe, the 3rd plenary council, although somebody might be able to correct me on this. But and also Catholic University of America came from the 3rd, although it was recommended the 2nd plenary council of Baltimore. But these various different councils of Baltimore, they did a lot of legislation. They gave various different doctrinal judgments as well. The first one was more concerned with the Immaculate Conception and the papacy. The second one with divine revelation and a lot of what would be covered at Vatican I under divine revelation and modern errors. And then the third one was kind of concerned with legislation. But there were a lot of different doctrinal points that were taught in a binding way that was inspired at the impetus of Rome. So Rome told them to discuss these various different things. It was in the oversight by an apostolic delegate from Rome. The acts and decrees were sent to Rome. They were looked over by Rome, and they were approved by Rome. So we have Rome. This isn't something merely, this is a council that, on its own authority was giving these various different declarations. That's not how it was at all. Rather, Rome was involved in every single aspect of this discussion. From beginning to end, Rome oversaw the whole process and then approved the teaching. And actually had an audience with Blessed Pius IX where specific changes encoding this teaching on the necessity of the church for salvation, encoding this teaching on the possibility of baptism of desire, was recommended explicitly by Rome to be included so as to clarify the teaching on this matter. So explicitly, Rome went and said, hey, you're talking about the necessity of the church for salvation? Well, you forgot to make these comments on invincible ignorance. So here are some comments you can add on to it. They didn't have it before. Rome told them to add this. They said, you mentioned the necessity of baptism for salvation. Well, somebody might misunderstand this. So to clarify, add whether in reality or in desire. These were things which were told to be added at the behest of Rome with the approval of Blessed Pius IX. So if these were heresies, who was Orthodox during this time? Was there nobody Orthodox in Rome? Was Blessed Pius IX himself not Orthodox? None of the cardinals in the Curia were Orthodox. None of the bishops in America were Orthodox. None of the theologians giving oversight of this were Orthodox. Is this really what you're telling me? It's really such an absurd narrative that you have to have as a Feeneyite to deny baptism of desire, to have this strange, weird view of the necessity of membership in the church, and to deny the perpetual tradition on this point. It's such a weird view that you have to have. So you have these 3. The second one was under Archbishop Spalding. Archbishop Spalding was originally from Tennessee. Archbishop Spalding, he actually has a very interesting set of lectures against Protestantism. Archbishop Spalding was pretty incredible. But this was called by Archbishop Spalding. He was the apostolic delegate. A letter was sent in January of 1866, and in January of 1866, Rome sent various different instructions for what they're supposed to talk about at this council. And then Archbishop Spalding decided that, along with as to the impetus from these instructions, in line with these instructions, that what he would do is he would provide a nice doctrinal presentation in the beginning of the decreta, so the decrees of the council. In the beginning of the decrees of the council, he would provide a doctrinal exposition of the Catholic faith. So this was something at the highest level. It was a dogmatic exposition approved by all the bishops, sent to Rome, approved by Rome, with various different explicit additions on these points, and at the approval of Blessed Pius IX. And actually, it gets even more interesting. Because during this time, during the council, the Vatican called Vatican I. So Vatican I was called during the Second Plenary Council of Baltimore, and they actually had to cut a lot of this short. So what the American bishops wanted to do is the American bishops wanted to reconvene the council so they could continue to discuss things after the Vatican I was dissolved. That's what they wanted to do. But Rome said, well, we can't really do this. They didn't think that would be proper. So Rome said, well, we'll just make sure we are extra careful in our overviews. That's why there is so much additional material that was actually provided from the Propaganda Fide and approved by Blessed Pius IX, because they wanted to make extra sure and to have a sort of extra overview of all this material. So it's like it's doubly checked. They were double checking their homework the entire time because the bishops of America said, hey, we didn't really have that much time to go over a lot of this stuff. So we want to meet again. And they said, well, we can't have that happen. So we'll just double check everything for you guys and give you a bunch of edits to your works. Okay. So not only was it checked by Rome, not only was it called by Rome, it was double checked by Rome at the request of the American bishops. So first we have this letter from Blessed Pius IX, and this is at the reception of the Acts of the Council. He said, quote, as for the acts of the aforementioned council celebrated by you, which, in accordance with the custom of our predecessors, you have submitted with great praise to our judgment and that of this apostolic see, for your remarkable devotion towards us and the same see, you will receive a fitting response concerning those acts from our congregation for the propagation of the faith. So this is with papal authority. This is at the behest of the Pope. He is looking over these things. Okay, this isn't something where the Pope was just like, okay, well, I know about your council. Your council's happening. I kind of know about it. And I'm just going to give you the general thumbs up. I trust you guys. I trust the plan. It's not kind of how synodality is done now or how the USCCB runs now. No, this was actually something where every little thing was looked over by the Pope at his judgment, at his oversight, in order to ensure that everything went well and there was nothing wrong. That's what I want to emphasize for you guys. And then we have, following from this, and this is a few months later, so he sent the letter in September of 1867. In January of 1868, that is when the response from Rome actually comes. And it gives the history behind how they looked over the various different acts and decrees of the Second Provincial Council of Baltimore. It says, with the consent of His Holiness, Pope Pius IX, by divine providence, in the month of October of the year 1866, the said synod was solemnly celebrated by all the archbishops, bishops, and apostolic vicars of the United States under the presidency of the Most Reverend Martin John Spalding, Archbishop of Baltimore and delegate of the Apostolic See. Many measures highly beneficial to discipline, the state of the dioceses, and the growth of the faith were determined in that assembly. These were all transmitted to the Sacred Congregation for the propagation of the faith for examination. The same Sacred Congregation, in its general meetings held on September 16th, 23rd, and 27th, 1867, carefully reviewed the acts and decrees of the said council. With a few corrections and observations, which it ordered to be communicated to the aforementioned apostolic delegate, Archbishop Spalding, in the attached letter, the Sacred Congregation most willingly approved them to be inviolably observed by all whom they concern. When the undersigned secretary of the same Sacred Congregation reported this decision to His Holiness, so this is being reported to the Pope, in an audience held on October 6th of the aforementioned year, His Holiness approved it in all respects, in order that this decree be issued regarding the matter. End quote. This is from January 24th, 1868. So you can look through all the lists of most of them are like weird legislative things of, hey, have you thought about this obscure case or this obscure canon, blah, 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 blah. This was before the 1917 Code of Canon Law. So a lot of it was legislative, but actually a few of them provide clarity on points of doctrine. There's two very important revisions that are important to note. So first, there's an addition that happens on the necessity of the church for salvation. So originally, they kind of have this general statement where they're like, yeah, the church is necessary for salvation. I'll show you the exact point at which it cuts off. They said, yeah, the church is necessary for salvation. And it kind of just stops there. But the propaganda fide at the behest and with the approval of Blessed Pius IX, says, nah, you need to add a little bit more about this because this could lack clarity, especially in an American context where you have a pluralistic society. You have a society with many Protestants, heretics, schismatics. So this is what it adds. Quote, not only did he never promise salvation to those living outside of the church, but he even threatened eternal damnation to those who, through their own fault, depart from this life outside of the church. But if they should err invincibly, so these are people departing their life outside of the church, but if they should err invincibly, so i.e. not through their own fault, like it said in the first sentence, so I know they'll do like this weird exegesis of this text. That's just how they are. But if they should err invincibly, and it was not their fault that they did not come to know the true church, so these are people erring invincibly at the departing of their death, and they do not come to know the true church. So these are very clearly people who are dying outside of the church. God, who punishes or condemns no one without their own fault, although they be detained by this inculpable ignorance outside the body of the church, yet if, with the help of divine grace, they have obeyed the divine commands, and those truths of the Christian faith which they recognize, will have mercy on them, lest they perish eternally. End quote. So there's this edition, very clearly not what the Feniites say. And then you have this second edition. And this is from Title 5, Chapter 2 on baptism, number 228. Although the original letter lists 248, it's 228. And it adds this. It says, well, when you're talking about baptism, you have to say necessary for salvation, either in reality, so in re, or in desire, in voto. So vel in voto, vel in re, either in reality or in desire. So this is affirming the necessity of baptism, either in reality or in desire, right? This is very clear. There is not a way of reading the Latin language to get around this. This says that either you can have baptism in reality, which incorporates you into the church as a member, or you can have baptism of desire, which, when you look at the decision from the Holy Office, can either be an explicit desire, like there are in catechumens, or an implicit desire, like there are for those who are not catechumens. So let's go back actually to I want to go and give the whole context to the first revision on the necessity of the church. And then we look at the baptism one, we see basically a few different texts actually that are approved that say the same thing. So it says, quote, to guard this most precious revelation and preserve it inviolate, because it begins by saying, oh, revelation, at Michael Lofton, revelation is something which is necessary for salvation, absolutely necessary for salvation. You can't have faith without divine revelation. This is something the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore goes into detail with as well, following especially the First Vatican Council. So to guard this most precious revelation and preserve it inviolate until the consummation of the world, Christ the Lord founded his church, in which, as in a fortress of truth and a secure bulwark, all the truths of his religion, the holy sacraments, and all else he taught, instituted, or mandated for the salvation of men might be safely preserved. This church, as a wise architect, he built upon a rock, and established on a solid foundation, confirming it with his divine promise, which can never fail, though heaven and earth may pass away, that the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, which he himself confirmed. He gave a strict command to all to listen to this church under the threat of total deprivation of his grace. And if he will not hear the church, let him be to thee as a heathen and publican. For he himself is established as head over all his church, which is his body, in the fullness of him who filled all in all. So at this point, we have a very strong statement of the necessity of the church. If you don't listen to the church, you will be damned. And it continues. And it says, since the Catholic Church has the living and true God as its author and head, it must necessarily be like God himself, one and divine. And those who voluntarily resist it, resist the very authority of God and bring condemnation upon themselves. So see, it's already kind of clear that this is what they meant when they add words like those who voluntarily resist it, because there are also those who, by consequence, involuntarily resist it. For Christ clearly commanded all to obey his church and become its members and obedient children, if they wish to be saved. And this is the point in which they cut it off. This is the point in which they cut it off. But the Vatican said, Rome said, the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith said, Blessed Pius IX said, you need to clarify on this point because people can very easily misunderstand what is being said here. And he says, this is the addition from the Propaganda Fide, not only did he never promise salvation to those living outside the church, but he even threatened eternal damnation to those who, through their own fault, depart from this life outside the church. But if they should err invincibly, and it was not their fault that they did not come to know the true church, God, who punishes or condemns no one without their own fault, although they be detained by this inculpable ignorance outside the body of the church, yet if, with the help of divine grace, they have obeyed the divine commands and those truths of the Christian faith, which they recognize, will have mercy on them, lest they perish eternally. End quote. This is what we have for the fifth paragraph. This is where the key addition from Rome comes into play. And then it goes on and actually quotes a text from Blessed Pius IX. And this is a text that often will be cited by many people against the Feniites. And the Feniites will give an explanation of this text that is not in line with the Second Vatican Council, okay? That's the way in which they will interpret this, not in line with the Holy Office decree under Venerable Pius XII, not in line with the consensus of the theologians, not in line with the consensus of the bishops at the First Vatican Council. They'll give an explanation of this text not in line with all of that, so devoid of all context of what Blessed Pius IX could have even meant from his own theologians who were cardinals under him, okay? Who taught at the colleges in Rome, who served in the Curia, okay? But what we see actually is in this fifth paragraph, we see basically a summary of what is being brought in the sixth. So we can interpret the sixth by the fifth. We can interpret this as basically Blessed Pius IX's own approved commentary on his own text. So this is what he says, December 9th, 1854. I'm sorry that the text is a little bit small. Maybe I should have made it bigger. But this is what is said. Quote, we have learned with grief that another error, not less melancholy, is introduced in certain parts of the Catholic world and has taken possession of the souls of many Catholics. Carried away with a hope for the eternal salvation of those who are out of the true Church of Christ, they do not cease to inquire with solicitude what shall be the fate and condition after death of men who are not submissive to the Catholic faith. Seduced by vain reasoning, they make to these questions replies comfortably to that perverse doctrine. Far from us, venerable brothers, to lay claim to put limits to the divine mercy, which is infinite. Far from us to scrutinize the counsels and mysterious judgments of God, unfathomable depth where human thought cannot penetrate. But it belongs to the duty of our apostolic office to excite your episcopal solicitude and vigilance, to make all possible efforts to remove from the minds of men the opinion, as impious as it is fatal, according to which people can find in any religion the way of eternal salvation. So we have here is a condemnation of indifferentism. We have a condemnation of indifferentism. But he goes on to explain what indifferentism does not entail. Employ all the resources of your minds and of your learning to demonstrate to the people committed to your care that the dogmas of the Catholic faith are in no respect contrary to the divine mercy and justice. Faith orders us to hold that out of the apostolic Roman Church no person can be saved, that it is the only ark of salvation, that whoever will not enter therein shall perish in the waters of the deluge. On the other hand, so he clarifies this. So at this point, if you cut it off, somebody say, well, this is clearly in line with the Feniite teaching on the matter. But he clarifies himself. He says, on the other hand, it is necessary to hold for certain that ignorance of the true religion, if that ignorance be invincible, is not a fault in the eyes of God. But who will presume to arrogate to himself the right to mark the limits of such an ignorance, holding in account the various conditions of peoples, of countries, of minds, and of the infinite multiplicity of human things? When delivered from the bonds of the body, we shall see God as he is. We will comprehend perfectly by what admirable and indissoluble bond the divine mercy and the divine justice are united. But as long as we are upon earth, bent under the weight of this mortal mass, which overloads the soul, let us hold firmly that which the Catholic doctrine teaches us, that there is only one God, one faith, one baptism. To seek to penetrate further is not permitted. However, as charity demands, Let us pour out before God incessant prayers, in order that from all parts all the nations may be converted to Christ. Let us labor as much as it is in us for the common salvation of men. The arms of the Lord are not shortened, and the gifts of the heavenly grace are never wanting to those who sincerely wish for them and who beg for the assistance of that light. End quote. So we see here is actually a twofold correction. We see in here a correction of the Feenite doctrine, because it brings up those who labor in invincible ignorance. And it also corrects a lot of those who are overly hopeful. And unfortunately, this has entered into the pale of certain magisterial documents. Those who are overly hopeful about the possibility of salvation for those outside of the Catholic Church. Those who wish to have more knowledge than they could possibly have. As he says, we're ignorant right here of the ways in which divine mercy and justice are joined among the nations. It is hard for us. It is impossible for us to draw the bounds and lines of invincible ignorance. We don't know where those lines are. And that's what he's clear to teach us right here. We don't know where those lines are. And we need to be careful about believing that we do know where these lines are. But this is very clearly not an acceptance of their teaching on the matter. Okay, then now on the other part I wanted to point to is I wanted to point to the part on the necessity of baptism. There's two paragraphs on this. The second one is where there was actually the addition, paragraph 228. But in 225, it says, quote, baptism not only cleanses the stain of guilt that we contracted through the sin of our first parents and all sins, if any committed by our actions, and confers the most abundant gifts of justice and holiness, but it is also so necessary for salvation, either in reality or in desire, that no one except the baptized has access to the kingdom promised by Christ. End quote. So very clearly, we have this going back and forth of necessary for salvation and necessary for salvation either in reality or in desire. Membership in the church or being joined to the church, why wouldn't it be the same thing? It really boggles my mind that a lot of people don't recognize this. So they'll say, oh, well, it talks about right here how submission to the Roman pontiff is absolutely necessary for salvation. Well, you get the same author saying the same thing about penance. They say the same thing about baptism. But you see, when they clarify on the points of penance or baptism, they include both in reality or in desire. So why wouldn't you have the same thing with being joined to the church? Why wouldn't you have the same thing with submission to the Roman pontiff? It makes no sense to me. Okay? It's actually a very natural way in which we use language. And it seems to be purposefully dull or maybe involuntarily dull, not to recognize that this is somehow how language is used. And then 228, this is where the clarification was added by Rome. Since baptism is so necessary for salvation, either in reality or in desire, so Rome made them add that it can be validly and licitly administered by anyone in urgent necessity, so on and so forth. Talks about the possibility of others administering baptism. But that's all that I have for this point. I guess I will turn to questions. But to give a point of summary and I guess a final exhortation, I would encourage many to recognize that it is very easy to be deceived by a partial presentation of the truth or by various different assumptions that we may make when we read certain texts. It's very easy to be deceived when this happens. So it's very easy. It seems on the face of things to be quite obvious when we see texts about the necessity of the Catholic Church, when we see texts about the necessity of baptism, when we see texts about the necessity of baptism for entrance in the church. When we look at these various different texts, it seems obvious, and it seems quite clear on the face of things that actually what this means, it means all of these things in reality. That when it's talking about the necessity of baptism, this is talking about the actual application of water. When it's talking about the necessity of being joined to the church, it's actually talking about being a member of the church. It could seem it's a very easy narrative to draw. But when you actually look at the explanations, when you look and follow what the Vatican has said, what the church has said, on interpreting all of these texts in line with the sense of the authors themselves, when you look what they were being taught, when you look at what they were teaching, when you look at the various different explanations given by the church throughout the ages, it's actually very clear that when they're using these terms, they have these qualifications in mind. And if you're trying to read all of these texts apart from the tradition, which the church has never said to do, to personally read these texts apart from the tradition, apart from what's taught in the theological schools, when you try to do that, it's very easy to fall into error. And I get it. I understand it. I'm not saying that you're stupid or dumb or anything like that. I'm actually very sympathetic with the inability to understand these various things, because it does get really complicated. You do actually have to dive into a lot of, you have to do your homework. You have to think through these problems a lot. But this is why the teaching magisterium of the church is morally necessary for interpreting these documents. We need the teaching of the church in order to correctly interpret and apply these documents. And there's something very fundamental missing if you are going to try to interpret these documents apart from the approved schools, which pass them down, apart from the schools wherein the authors of these documents came from, apart from the later clarifications of the magisterium. It's against every single principle of Catholic magisteriology to do this. But when you actually follow the principles of Catholic magisteriology, when you actually follow the teaching of the church and not some guy on YouTube, I'm not giving any of my opinions. I'm just some guy on YouTube. So if there's anything that I say that's from myself, ignore it. If there's anything that I say that's from proper authorities, listen to it, because it's not me who's speaking in that case. When you try to do these things in a piecemeal and patchwork way, resting on your own understanding, it's very easy to fall into these traps. Okay? It's extremely easy to fall into these traps. So you need the tradition. You need the interpretive tradition. You need the clarifications from the church. You can't do this on your own. And actually, I think that where a moral default actually does enter, I get the sort of zeal of fidelity. No matter what a million people say, and I agree with this, no matter what a million people say, no matter if I'm the only one saying it, if I am representing the teaching of the church, then I'm representing the teaching of the church, and I don't care what other people say. People can disagree with me all they want. But in order to properly interpret this teaching, one needs to keep in mind the total force of the magisterium of the church and the tradition that is meant to communicate these throughout the various different ages, etc. So I get it. But where a moral defect does enter in is when you have the defect of pertinacity. Pertinacity. What's pertinacity? Pertinacity is a reliance on one's own will. That is a reliance on one's own judgment. So pertinacity enters in when one is so attached to their own will and own judgment that they actually substitute what is not there, what is not in the text. They substitute something for what is in the text. So when they read a certain text from the magisterium and it says the church is necessary for salvation, to be joined to the church is necessary for salvation, what they'll actually do is they'll actually be so pertinacious, so attached to their own judgment, that they'll see other people interpret this as one needs to be a member through sacramental baptism in order to be saved. That's what they'll read this as. And they'll substitute that judgment for the actual authentic judgment which is given by the church. And when they are corrected on this, because the text actually doesn't say that, and it's completely in line with what the theologians during the time believed all the way up until today, and what the further declarations of the magisterium say, when you correct them on this, they will become pertinacious. They will attach themselves to their own judgment and refuse to actually hear out what is the reasonable interpretation of many wise, holy, and pious men. And that's actually, it gets into the realm, it gets in the territory of pride, it gets in the territory of foolishness, it gets in the territory of various different vices that needs to be removed from the soul. So I am very sympathetic. I'm not here to, call you stupid, call you dumb, say that I don't like, be a jerk, anything like that. But this is very clearly a position that is not thought through. And when you have all of the details, when you have all of the facts about the reception of this teaching, what you see is that the teaching of the church, guided by the Holy Spirit, stands immortal. Always has, always will. Okay, so now I'm going to get through the super chats. Since we're at about 50 minutes, and then, I will get going. I'm surprised I didn't cough during that whole thing. Slideshow, pulling a Duong, I see. Do you guys like the slideshow? I actually do like the slideshow. The slideshow makes it a lot easier for me. If I'm doing a monologue from notes or something like that, I do actually prefer to have something in front of you guys because many have said that it's helpful. But do you guys find it helpful? I used to be very anti-Vatican II. Reading most of the documents showed me that basically majority of its teachings aren't novelty, but pretty historical. Yeah, there's a lot of these key fundamental distinctions. When you read the pre-conciliar theologians, that's what helped me the most in understanding the teachings of the Second Vatican Council, is reading a lot of the pre-conciliar theologians, because post-conciliar theologians, they'll just state stuff in such weird and haphazard ways, and I'm not a huge fan of it. When you look at the preconciliar theologians and you take into account the ways in which their teachings can apply to the doctrines brought up in Vatican II, I myself, I'm not a genius. I'm not brilliant. I'm nothing like that. I kind of just read it, and sometimes I see the ways in which they connect, and then it clicks. It's not a very difficult process. I haven't went through every single doctrine like that, but every single doctrine, what gives me hope is that every single doctrine that I have went through like that, I just see it, and it makes sense to me. Yeah, it's this connection between the pre and post conciliar church, which moors Vatican II within history. But yeah, it's kind of something where you have to just be patient. It's not a very easy, instant clicking for every single issue. You have to be patient. You have to be able to follow a line of argument. You have to be able to follow the reasoning and the explanation. And if you don't know, you don't know. That's the best part. That's the best part of all of this. If you don't know, if you don't understand, if you can't figure out how these two teachings mesh together, so what? So what? I mean, I'm sure there were many people in the ancient and the medieval church who had difficulties reconciling magisterial teachings. This happens in every single age, okay? If you can't reconcile it, so what? Can you explain the unity of the Godhead and the Trinity of persons? Okay, that's a very difficult thing to do. It takes a lot of time and a lot of research to begin to understand how the church has traditionally held those two things together. Just because there's these difficulties that most people aren't able to understand how they reconcile doesn't mean it's false. And actually, what I found for myself is that as I have dug into two supposedly irreconcilable statements, and as I've researched them more and more, I've actually found myself understanding the doctrine a lot better. And when I do find a resolution, I come away with it enriched by it. So if you just can't do it, it's not a huge deal. You don't need to go and apostatize, become Eastern Orthodox, become a Sedevacantist, become a Protestant, atheist, whatever. You don't need to do those things. It's actually, I think, very unrealistic that you would expect yourself to be able to do all of those things. Wagner is so close to taking the Richard Ibriani pill. No pope since 1130 AD, and no clergy either, and no Basil, Jerome, Chrysostom, or St. Thomas. You basically need to conclude this if you believe in Fenianism plus Sedevacantism. Yeah, so I was actually sent a weird new form of Sedevacantism. I was emailed. I think they said that the last pope was St. Pius X, maybe? And they're like anti-Pope Benedict XV, anti-Pope Pius XII. I've been wanting to do like a chill stream of some sort, going over and doing a deep dive into this weird form of Sedevacantism. Sometimes people find those entertaining. Maybe I'll do that sometime this week. Maybe I don't know. The super rigid understanding of extraclesiam nullis salus falls apart when you show them the catechumens are members of the church, but they too can be saved by their desire. Should they die before baptism? Thanks, Wagner. Yes, few know this. This is actually one of the biggest shocks is you'll have a lot of people who are inconsistent trads. They won't be Feniites. They'll believe in baptism of blood and desire, but they won't believe in the Vatican II position on Protestants, the possibility of salvation for Protestants, let's say. But these are completely incoherent because on the one hand, they want to say, oh, only members of the Catholic Church, which is also the question of, okay, we think these Protestants are not culpably in heresy and schism. So are you going to justify the fact that inculpable heresy and schism separate somebody from the Catholic Church? Which theologian has believed this? Strange to me. But actually, we're a very small minority who believe this, but that was a rhetorical question. But so did I I just completely went. Oh yeah. So on the one hand, they'll say, "Oh, I actually need to be members of the church to be saved," and they'll believe in like baptism with desire. So they're denying the teaching of the church on the necessity of baptism for membership in the church. They think that one is a member of the church by desire or something like that, something weird. But yeah, you see a lot of these like radically inconsistent because most don't want to take the Feeneyite pill. You see these very radically inconsistent positions on this. Thoughts on Joseph Kloitkin? Did he say anything about this topic? Sorry if already discussed. Came in late. Yeah, Kloitkin. Yes. So he was the he was the guy at Vatican I who actually gave the explanation of the original De Ecclesia, which held to this doctrine. So yeah, Kloitkin discusses this, and he holds to the position that literally everyone else held to. But yes, I have read Kloitkin, not in his Theology Dave, however the frick you pronounce the German. You know the German phrase. That one. No, that one. It's not translated, but I'm not remembering off the top of my head. I translated the table of contents to that just so I would have it for a point of reference. I cannot remember off the top of my head whether he discusses this point or not. But that's because no Feeneyites existed back then. No Feeneyites existed in the late 19th century. Nobody believed this. Nobody believed this at all. So there was no need to make massive responses, but they still explain this doctrine. Okay. Wagner, I could be dense, but I'm struggling how to know if I'm part of the elect or not based on my sinfulness. How to weigh desires versus actions. You don't really need to worry about whether you're part of the elect or not. You just need to worry about whether you're in a state of grace or not. Whether you're part of the elect or not is not important because that's not something in principle without a special revelation that you could know. And it's also not something which is necessary because God carries out the means in the end as well. So he's going to carry out salvation through the means of sanctifying grace. And one can come to make a probable judgment that they are in a state of grace through the effects of prayer. The fact that there is one can discern within themselves during prayer that there are motions of contrition, motions of the love of God, assent to the Catholic faith, et cetera, et cetera. Protestant teachers who create a caricature of Catholicism to lead people away are not my question. What of those who learn from these never presented a true picture of Catholic teaching and deny to conform what fate? The grammar in this is kind of hard to understand. So I'm assuming you're asking the distinction between those who are given a caricature of Catholicism and grow up in a state where they aren't truly presented a genuine picture of Catholicism versus those heresiarchs and learned men who have a greater obligation. Well, this would just come down to the principles of conscience again. St. Alphonsus Liguori, he discusses this in particular and says that for these people, they are invincibly ignorant. Now, somebody could be invincibly ignorant and also damned. Keep that in mind. But as a whole, we can ordinarily expect people in these sorts of situations to be invincibly ignorant. Doesn't mean they're all saved or anything like that. It just means that they are not culpable for the act of remaining outside of the church. Just coming back. Yes, more slideshows. Thank you. Thank you for the super chat. Ernst von Garlock. St. Dominic died 804 years ago. St. Dominic, pray for us. So true. Never trust Chris because he crossed applesauce. Okay, thank you for the super chat. Yes, so this one. I find it odd hearing Wagner struggling to pronounce German. I know, it's so embarrassing. I can't pronounce any German. I also don't want to learn theological German. I thought about it. I actually thought about learning theological German. But theological German is very different than modern German. And I've heard that it's very hard to learn. Like even a lot of modern German speakers, like native speakers, can't really understand it. Oh, grammar was poor because I couldn't spend more than $20 on the. Okay. Just make it. Yeah, I was very confused about the grammar part of it. Okay. Anyways, I appreciate it. I'm Hispanic and I don't barely know Spanish. Well, you have no excuse. My family literally moved over here like 300 years ago. So it's been a while since my family. Actually, it hasn't been a while since my family spoke German because we spoke German till like World War One. But it's been longer than you. Okay, like my grandparents didn't speak German or anything like that. Anyways, despite how interesting it is to talk about theological German, it's about an hour. So I'm going to get going. I hope that you all appreciate this. Remember to like, subscribe. If you really appreciate, then I would encourage you to become a patron. Any amount counts. If you're a $5 patron, this entire channel is built on the backs of $5 patrons. So if you become a patron at patreon.com/Milton Thomas, I'd very much appreciate it. And it lets me continue to do what I do. So as always, God bless.